Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in this evening for our online Bible study. Let's get into it. I welcome you. If you are new to the study, I'm Pastor Dave St. Aubin. It's a joy to be with you here this evening. Tonight, we begin our look at the book of Lamentations, and we will be looking at chapter 1. So I invite you to grab your Bibles, open them up to Lamentations chapter 1, grab something to take some good notes with, grab a beverage, and grab a snack. Let's get into it. Well, again, good evening and welcome, and thanks for tuning in. I do pray that your day has been going well. Pray that your week's been going well. Pray that you had a good weekend, and welcome to another evening of study as we continue our journey through the Bible one chapter at a time. And we began this study back in September of 2022 with Genesis chapter 1, and every weeknight since that date, we've been moving through the Bible, one chapter after another, and now we've made it into the book of Lamentations. And so whether this is your first time with us, or maybe you've been with us from the very beginning of the study, or maybe you've joined somewhere in between, I welcome you. We have folks from all over the country joining in this online study. And I just want to thank you all for being here. We have folks here in Nebraska, as well as Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas, and Florida, New Jersey, Arizona, California, Washington State. It's just a blessing to be with you here tonight. We are beginning a new book, Lamentations. We just finished Jeremiah last week, and now we are moving into the next book. It's just 5 short chapters, but tonight will be a little bit longer of a study because I want to give an introduction, as I've done with every book since we began with Genesis, and then we'll dive right in. But the book of Lamentations, the title that we have, the English title, comes from the Jewish Talmud, which calls it Lamentations. In the Hebrew Bible, the title it means alas, or how. That's the first Hebrew word in the first, the second, and the fourth chapter of this book, alas. In the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, this book is referenced as wailings. And Lamentations comes after the book of Jeremiah. In the Bibles that we have today, most of the Bibles, because of its connection with the destruction of Jerusalem, which Jeremiah recorded. And it also follows the book of Jeremiah because of the Jewish tradition that Jeremiah wrote both of these books. Now, we don't know for certain who wrote Lamentations. The book doesn't identify its writer, but the common view is that Jeremiah wrote this book. Now, in the English translation of the Septuagint, the Greek translation, Lamentations begins with, "And it came to pass after Israel had been taken away into captivity, and Jerusalem had been laid waste, that Jeremiah sat weeping and lamented over Jerusalem." Now, translators have deduced that Jeremiah wrote this book, and part of that assumption is that in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verse 25, we read, "Jeremiah lamented for Josiah, and all the singing men and all the singing women spake of Josiah in their lamentations to this day, and made them an ordinance in Israel. And behold, they are all written in the Lamentations." So the book of Lamentations It doesn't record a lament for Josiah, but this reference in Chronicles connects Jeremiah with the book of Lamentations. So it's probably written by Jeremiah, but it's most likely intentionally left anonymous in order to allow anyone to identify with the grief of this book, as we see, or we will see on Wednesday in chapter 3, verse 1, that begins, I am the man who has seen the affliction. And again, the assumption is that this man was Jeremiah, but we don't know for certain. Now, the basis for the view that this book was written before 561 BC, when Ewell Merodach, which we looked at in Jeremiah chapter 52 on Friday, before he became king of Babylon, and before Jehoiachin was released from prison by this king of Babylon, that this book was written. And the basis for that view is the absence of any kind of national hope at this point. We will see on Wednesday there is some hope expressed within this book in chapter 3, but it's more of a personal hope than a national hope. So, assuming that Jeremiah wrote this book, he probably did so in Judah following the destruction of Jerusalem, when he was either in Judah still or when he had gone to Egypt, where he spent apparently the last years of his life, or maybe written when he was in both places. But the destruction of Jerusalem is the event in which this long narrative from the book of Genesis through the book of Kings culminates. This is what the prophets had warned about for centuries. And Lamentations now leaves its mark on all subsequent literature of the Bible. Everything up to this point was building up to this destruction of Jerusalem. Now, the book of Lamentations, only 5 chapters, so it consists of 5 different laments, each chapter a different lament, or in translations, a funeral song, or a song of mourning. And all but the third lament, all but chapter 3, describes the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the aftermath out of that. So what we're going to see throughout this week in this book is chapter 1 tonight. We will see the misery of the citizens of Jerusalem. Tomorrow, chapter 2, we'll look at God's punishment of Jerusalem. Chapter 3, we will look at Jeremiah's personal reactions. And again, chapter 3, verse 1, I am the man. So we are assuming Jeremiah. Chapter 4, we will look at God's severity towards Jerusalem. And then chapter 5, we will look at the response of the godly. So when we read through this book, we have to not just take into account what happened in the day of Jeremiah and what happened in the day of the Judeans and what happened in the day of those who lived in Jerusalem. There are many warnings in this book about the judgment that would come. That's what happened in Jeremiah. And then the mournings over that judgment that had come, that's what we'll see in the book of Lamentations. But the church today is very similar to the people of Judah at that time. Our times are very similar to Jeremiah's times. Today, we minister in a cultural context that is very similar to Jeremiah's in his time. And Lamentations helps us to see the parallels between our culture and Jeremiah's culture. What are those similarities? Well, first, the people had abandoned God. And what that means is that it's not that people ceased to believe that God existed, but rather that God was irrelevant to their lives. That was true of the pagans in general, and at the time of Jeremiah, it was true to them, and it's also true of God's people today. At the time of Jeremiah, worship had become boring. It had become unsatisfying. And so the religious leaders of the day catered to the people's desires rather than confronting them with their disobedience. They caved in and gave the people what they want. And we see that quite a bit in worship today, that worship has changed in such a way that it's catering to what people are looking for, so it doesn't feel boring. In Jeremiah's day, the people had departed from God's word. They believed that it was irrelevant, and they stopped paying attention to what God had said. And we see that same thing today in many churches. We see it in Christianity quite a bit, that people believe that God does exist, but His word is irrelevant, and then as a result, stop paying attention to what God says. Now, most of the people at the time of Jeremiah had stopped reading the law of Moses. They had stopped reading through the Torah, and that opened up a door to ignorance of God's will, which led to disobedience and then led to punishment. And we see that quite a bit today. And then one last parallel. In the day of Jeremiah, people put their trust in other things. And specifically, they looked to other alliances. They looked to the Egyptians, they looked to the Assyrians, they looked to the Babylonians, they looked anywhere they could to find some hope, everywhere except God. They did not turn to God or trust in God for provision or protection or God's promises. And as a result, that led to this punishment that came upon them. We see the same thing today, that where Christians turn to everywhere else, looking for some hope, trying to trust in everything else except God's word, and it's going to lead to some very bad results. It leads to apostasy. It leads to departure from God. So we have a lot to look at tonight. Let's get right into it. Open up your Bibles to Lamentations chapter 1. And if you don't have a Bible, not a problem. As always, we put all the verses up here on the screen for you so you can follow along and take some good notes tonight. And Lamentations chapter 1, we'll start with verse 1. And in these first 7 verses, we see the extent of the desolation of the people of Jerusalem. And then verses 8 through 11 will describe the cause of that. So verse 1. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once great among the nations, was once great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. What we're going to see throughout this book, this personification of this city, Jerusalem, as a woman. It's a very common image in prophetic literature, but it's really developed here in the book of Lamentations. And we're going to see this myriad of images of Jerusalem related to a woman. Where these images are quickly going to shift between a lonely widow to a degraded princess, to a prostitute, to a victim of rape, to a betrayed lover, and to a abandoned wife. And Lamentations as a whole is going to express the grief of the people of Jerusalem through these images. So first, Jeremiah, here speaking as the narrator, is bewailing this abandoned city of Jerusalem that had once been glorious, had once been independent. This verse, as I mentioned earlier, begins with the word alas. It's a cry of despair. It's a cry of horror. It's a cry of lament that was often associated with funeral laments at the time. So here we see this first image of a woman. After the destruction of the city, Jerusalem is personified as a woman, solitary as a widow. And Jerusalem had changed. It had changed numerically. They had dwindled down in size. They had changed economically. Their prosperity was gone. And socially, they had changed. So Jerusalem This city, which used to be close to God, had been changed by the choice of just some very significant men within the city, the leaders that led the people away from God. They had turned away from God. They had led the people away from God. Now their city was under siege. Now there is death in the city. So right out of the gate, the narrator, the writer, Jeremiah, is seeking to elicit some pity from the reader right from the start. Verse 2. Bitterly she weeps at night. Again, this imagery of Jerusalem as being a woman. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have all become her enemies. So Jeremiah is personifying Jerusalem now as a young girl who has been abandoned by her lovers and betrayed by her friends. And normally crying at night or weeping at night, it gives way to sleep. In this case, it does not. And when crying does not give way to sleep, sorrow comes in instead. And that's what is taking place here. There is no rest. So the first of these 5 lamentations, it has one monotonous theme repeated several times throughout. There's no one to comfort. Verse 2, we'll see it in verse 9, 16, 17, 21. There's no one to comfort. This vivid description of the desolation of Jerusalem, the city of God, in this one introductory verse, it's like the heavy gong of a funeral bell, that there is no one left to comfort us. Verse 3. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations, and she finds no resting place, and all who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. So now Jeremiah is expounding on the tragedy of the condition of Jerusalem in verses 3 through 6. So Judah, this personified daughter of Jerusalem, had gone into exile because of the affliction and the servitude that God had allowed Babylon to impose on the people of Judah. They were out of the promised land now. And God had told them they would find rest in the promised land, and now they were gone. There would be no rest. Now there was only distress for the people who were now forced to live in exile among the Gentiles. The reference to Judah in verse 3, that after the affliction, Judah has gone into exile. What that means is that a significant number of the people of Judah had gone into exile. Remember, there were still a few left, but not many. The majority were gone. There was no rest. All there was distress. They were living among the Gentiles. Verse 4. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her appointed festivals. All of her gateways are desolate. Her priests groan, and her young women grieve, and she is bitter. She is in bitter anguish. So, the word Zion here, the roads to Zion, it's a poetic name for Jerusalem. The name Zion itself is not just a simple synonym for Jerusalem. It's a unique term for Jerusalem because it's the location of the worship. It was the temple city. It was the dwelling place of Yahweh. And now nobody is coming to the feasts in Jerusalem. Nobody is traveling the roads in anymore because they're all in exile. And because of that, because the roads are empty, even the roads are mourning, that all the pilgrims that used to travel into Jerusalem, nobody's coming anymore. And so nobody was covering these roads with joyful singing on their pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Even the roads were grieving. And the gates of the city were groaning, were mourning, because there was no more constant flow of people in and out of the city. The gates were that's where people conducted their business. That's where the people congregated. That's where they carried out their legal transactions. That's where they socialized. And we've looked at all that throughout the last several books. And now it's desolate. And even the priests had left. And even the few virgins who were left there were lonely and miserable. Again, complete desolation, only distress, no more rest. Verse 5. Her foes, Jerusalem's foes, have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. Jerusalem's enemies, they had become the masters of Jerusalem. And they had humiliated Jerusalem. God had caused the Babylonians to prevail because of the sins of the people of Jerusalem. And at this point, Jeremiah or whoever authored this book reveals one of the most significant theological concepts of Lamentations. What has happened to the people happened because of their sins. Over and over and over again, all throughout Jeremiah, Jeremiah affirmed that God had decreed to punish the people and was going to send this calamity. Chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, all throughout Jeremiah up until the end. Jeremiah had shared this. You have brought this on yourselves, and her children have gone into exile, captive before the foe. The city was even devoid of children, because now even they were in captivity. Verse 6, and all the splendor has departed from daughter Zion. Her princes are like deer that find no pasture. In weakness they have fled before the pursuer. So this once majestic daughter Zion, God's daughter, now sits in humiliation. But it's not Zion's daughter that is really being addressed, because Zion does not have a daughter. Zion itself is the daughter. It is God's daughter, God's chosen. And now all of the leaders, all of the splendor of Zion, including King Zedekiah and all of his advisors and all of his court, they had all fled like frightened deer, like frightened stags that couldn't find pasture. They had been strong in the past, but now they were weak, and they fled. They were in exile. Verse 7. And in the days of her affliction and wandering, Jerusalem remembers all the treasures that were hers in days of old. When her people fell into enemy hands, there was no one to help her, right? No, that's what I share. There's no one to help. Her enemies looked at her and laughed at her destruction. So Jerusalem now, the people, all they can do is look back on better times. Now that they're in exile, that's all they have are the memories. And they had remembered how no other nations came to their aid, came to help her. Instead, they all mocked her. When the Babylonians besieged them, right? The Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, all they did was laugh. Nobody came to the aid of the Israelites. So we see the destruction in these first 7 verses of Jerusalem. Now in verses 8 through 11, we come to the cause for the destruction. So now, having lamented the desolation of Jerusalem, now the lament is on the sins of the city. Jerusalem, verse 8, has sinned greatly, and so has become unclean. All who honored her despise her, for they have all seen her naked. She herself groans and turns away. So Jerusalem's great sinning had resulted in becoming this unclean, despised, like an overexposed woman, like a naked woman. Now, in this time period in history, to have one's body exposed was an utter disgrace. Jerusalem was disgraced. They had embarrassed themselves. Their sins and their vices, they've all come to light. Everybody is seeing them for who they were. And so Jeremiah begins to explain why this calamity has fallen onto Jerusalem. And remember, the imagery here is all about relating to a woman, to first to being a lonely widow, and then to being a losing my train of thought here, a degraded princess. That's what we saw in the first two verses, and now to an exposed to a shamed woman, to a betrayed lover, where everybody had left her. Right. The theme here is now examined more closely. And this really becomes more of the major theological emphases in this book. Verse 9. Her filthiness clung to her skirt. So not only was she exposed as being naked, the dirt on the hem of her skirt that would stick to her skin is now that's being symbolized the sin that had stuck to them. It was like dirt on the hem of a skirt. That's what their sin had done. It exposed them for who they were, and her filthiness has clung to her skirts. She has not considered her future. Her fall was astounding. There was no one to comfort her. Again, we see that verse. There's none to comfort. Lord, Lord, on my affliction, look, because the enemy has triumphed. This once proud city has now fallen. Why? Because it had not considered the consequences of its apostasy. It had mocked God. And now that sin had stuck to her like dirt sticks to the hem of a garment. And now the enemy has gained the upper hand. And again, there is no one to comfort. Verse 10. The enemy laid hands on all her treasures. She saw pagan nations enter the sanctuary. Those you had forbidden had entered the sanctuary, entered your assembly. We'll talk about that in a second here, but this is imagery here. It's very graphic. God had allowed the Babylonians to force their way in to the holy sanctuary and desecrate it and steal the treasures of the temple. This is imagery of being raped. And the only people that were allowed into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, was the high priest. The only ones that were allowed into the inner court were the authorized priest. And now all these Gentiles that were forbidden from entering, they are entering into the temple. It's imagery of being not just raped, but being gang raped. And remember, Zion is God's daughter. So if Zion has been dishonored and shamed and humiliated, so too has God. And so this punishment is coming upon the people. Verse 11, all her people groan as they search for bread. They barter their treasures for food to keep themselves alive. Look, Lord, and consider, for I am despised. So the residents of the city, they didn't have enough to eat. Even though they had traded all their valuables, their treasures for food, they still didn't have enough to eat. So they cry out again to God in this despised condition. Verse 12. Now, verses 12 through 19 record Jerusalem's call to people who had observed this desolation. And then verses 20 through 22 contain the call to God. The emotional, psychological progress that is realized in this first lament, it moves from a more distant descriptive third-person type reporting in verses 1 through 11, now to a more personal, private, first-person speech in the remaining verses. So verse 12. Is it nothing to you, all who pass by? Look around and see. Is there any suffering like my suffering? So again, now we are in the first person. That was inflicted on me, that the Lord brought on me in the day of his fierce anger. So in this classic expression of grief, Jerusalem is bewailing the lack of concern, that her desolate condition is drawing from onlookers. Remember, we saw in Jeremiah, people would pass by and see all this, and all they could do is just say, wow, right? Nobody cared. And that pain became great. It became uniquely great because God had now poured out his wrath on this people. Verse 13, from on high he sent fire. He sent it down into my bones. God had sent this fire into the bones of the city when he allowed the Babylonians to burn it. And he had captured Jerusalem like a prisoner in a net. He spread a net for my feet, and he turned me back and made me desolate, faint all the day long. Now, the net here doesn't refer to like a hunting net where you would go out and trap. It refers to a military implement that was used to hold those who were already captured to prevent them from escaping. Those types of nets are pictured all throughout ancient battle scenes. And when we get into Ezekiel, we will see more mention of this in Ezekiel 12 and chapter 17. But God had thoroughly desolated, demoralized the city of Jerusalem by removing all sustenance from it. This is a picture of a thoroughly, completely demoralized people. Verse 14. My sins have been bound into a yoke. By his hands they were woven together. They have been hung on my neck, and the Lord has sapped my strength. He has given me into the hands of those I cannot withstand. So it was God who would put Jerusalem into a yoke like putting an ox into a yoke. In other words, they had lost their freedom. Now, what does a yoke do? It helps to control. Others were controlling the people, the Babylonians. They couldn't stand by themselves any longer. Verse 15. The Lord has rejected all the warriors in my midst. He has summoned an army against me to crush my young men. In his winepress, the Lord has trampled virgin daughter Judah. God had removed all of the strong men from the city, and he had trodden Jerusalem down like a virgin trotting down grapes in a winepress. In other words, he had squeezed the life out of the city. And instead of gathering Israel for one of their traditional festivals where people would, at the least, they would speak of God, God here is calling for a new festival. This festival would destroy the nation's choicest young men. They would be gone. And what we've seen in these last few verses, 12, 13, 14, 15, we've seen four different metaphors that describe God's judgment of Jerusalem. Verse 12, fire. Verse 13, a net. Again, these are metaphors of God's judgment. Verse 14, a yoke. And verse 15, a winepress. So you see the imagery here, these metaphors describing God's judgment of Jerusalem. Verse 16. This is why I weep, and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near again to comfort me. There's no one to offer comfort, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed. Jerusalem is crying out because of their condition, and because no one cares, and no one is seeking to comfort them, and no one is seeking to strengthen them, and the people are miserable because the enemy has triumphed over them. Verse 17. So Zion stretches out her hand, but again, no one is there to comfort her. Rather than comforting Zion, who is appealing to others with outstretched hands, all these neighbors around Jerusalem, they've withdrawn. They've withdrawn from Jerusalem as if it is some kind of unclean thing. The Lord has decreed for Jacob that his neighbors become his foes. Jerusalem has become an unclean thing to them. Stretching out the hand and asking for help, in this case, it's a posture of prayer. So not only are the people reaching out their hands asking for help from all the other nations around them, they're crying out to God. And there's no response from these nations, and there's no response from God. And the reference to Jacob here indicates that all of Jacob's descendants, not just the people of Judah, but all of the Israelites, they are the object of God's punishment. And so from this point forward, God, Yahweh, becomes the major topic, the major theme of this book. Verse 18, the Lord is righteous, and yet I rebelled against his command. Listen, all you peoples, look on my suffering. My young men, my young women, they have all gone into exile. The last part of this first lament begins right here, and it records the city's detailed prayer to God. By confessing that the Lord was right, Jeremiah is expressing a very important truth, and he's confessing for the city their rebellion. They should have done this long ago, but now Jeremiah is confessing for them. The only reason all these people in Judah and Jerusalem were where they were in these days of Jeremiah is because they turned away from the Word of God. The only reason that people today, Christians today, are in the situation they are in is because they've turned away from the revelation of God and then become under the moral judgment of God. And this is a rub today that do we want to accept the fact that God hates sin? What is said more and more today is that God is love, and that theme is played for all of its worth, and I agree, and we should agree. God is love. And the church certainly needs to learn how to take the love of God into the world, that others come to know God. And oftentimes we have failed to do that. But I think the theme on God is a God of love, it's an overemphasis that diminishes that God is also a God of judgment, and God is a God of righteousness, and God is holy, and God is just in what he does. And God's punishment to the people of Judah was just, and God's punishment on us today is just. And the people of Judah at the time were mourning the loss of what came out of that judgment, and now they are in exile. We need to be very aware that God is a God of justice, a God of righteousness, a God of judgment, and God's is holy, and he is just in all that he does. Verse 18 is the key verse in the book of Lamentations, that the Lord is righteous, and I rebelled against his command. It's the whole reason Jerusalem at this point in time lay in ruins. Verse 19, I called to my allies, but they betrayed me. My priests and my elders perished in the city while they searched for food to keep themselves alive. The city had called on its political allies that it tried to ally with at the beginning of Jeremiah, right? Egypt and the Assyrians and all these other Gentile nations. It's calling to them for help. It's calling to its own leaders for help. But nobody's coming to help. And even the priests and the elders, the leaders, had been selfishly taking care of themselves rather than guarding the people. And so now it's all turned in this calamity. And in the last 3 verses, we see Jerusalem's cry out to God. Behold, Lord, how distressed I am. Verse 20. I am in torment within, and in my heart I am disturbed, for I have been most rebellious. Outside, the sword bereaves. Inside, there is only death. The city was greatly distressed because of this calamity that had come upon it, not because of the sin that caused it, which that's what they should have been upset about, is their sin. They were more concerned about the punishment. And the streets and the houses, and they had all become places of death, and they all stood empty. Verse 21, and people have heard my groaning, but there is no one to comfort me. And there's that verse again, right? No one's to comfort me. All my enemies have heard my distress. They rejoice at what you have done. May you bring the day you have announced on them, so that they may become like me. So Jerusalem's enemies heard of this calamity, and they rejoiced over it, right? Jerusalem is no more. Judah is no more. And their enemies are rejoicing over that. And the city, the people, the exiles are now praying. They are wishing that God's predicted judgment that all came to pass on them would now fall on these enemies that are rejoicing over their destruction, so that they too would become defeated and desolate. In verse 22, let all their wickedness come before you. Deal with them as you have dealt with me because of all my sins. My groans are many, and my heart is faint. So the people are asking God to consider the wickedness of all these nations that were rejoicing and take vengeance on them for the way that they treated the Israelites. Because now they are weak, the Israelites are. They are groaning under this divine judgment because of their sins. And so God, look at what they did to us. Punish them as well. This chapter, this first lament, deals with this topic of grief. How do we deal with grief? How are we supposed to cope with grief? And Jeremiah here, under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, aids us in coping with grief, just as he helped himself and the mourning Jewish community on the heels of this, one of the greatest tragedies to ever come upon the nation Israel. This is one of the most tear-filled chapters in the book of Lamentations. Out of the 5, this is the one. And through these words, Jeremiah is teaching Israel how to cope with their grief. How do we cope with grief? And that's what's going to be taught here throughout these next several chapters. So we're going to stop there. That is Lamentations chapter 1. I do pray that's been a help. These are very challenging words to read through, and we really got to dig into the meat of it and what it's really all about. And even after losing their city being destroyed, their temple being destroyed, the people being taken into exile, the land devastated, nothing left, they are mourning their loss, but more so they are mourning what happened and not considering why it happened. They are not considering the results of their sin in the face of a holy God, and that's something we need to consider ourselves as we read through these books and through these chapters of Lamentations and the next couple books. We need to remember, yes, God is love. God is a God of love, but God is a God of justice, and God is holy. And we need to remember that our sin is in the face of God brings punishment. It brought it onto the Israelites. It will bring it onto us. What we are called to do in the face of that is confess and repent and turn back to the will of God. That is Lamentations chapter 1. I pray that that has been a help to you. Tomorrow we'll look at chapter 2, the second lament, and we will look at this divine punishment of Jerusalem. So thank you for being here this evening. I do appreciate you taking time to be here, and I pray that you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Till then, take care, and God bless. Bye-bye.